Hello and welcome to Call to the Workforce. I'm your host, Emily Chipman. Today on the podcast, we have my podcast producer, Christine Baird, with us. We really felt like fair is fair. And if I'm going to interview a bunch of people, then someone needs to interview me and I need to experience the hot seat as well. So welcome to the show, Christine.
Thank you so much. I'm truly delighted to be here.
Christine, I always like to introduce our guests. So let me do a little intro to our audience so that they know a little bit more about you before you put me on the hot seat. Christine is a podcast producer who loves podcast hosting and design. After years in corporate sales, Christine did a career 180 and has been working in media production and content strategy since 2014. She worked on the Lewis Howes brand, the School of Greatness, for 4 years, where she grew his top-ranked podcast from less than 1 million downloads to over 80 million. She knows what she's doing. In 2018, she stepped away from producing that brand and started Worthful Media. Since then, it has grown to support dozens of small businesses, personal brands, and larger endeavors in launching and growing shows with impact. And let me just tell you, I have been so thankful for Christine. She has really supported me in feeling a lot more confident in the work that we're doing. And I could not imagine a better person to put me in the hot seat than Christine, even though, like many of my guests, I feel a little bit nervous today. So, Christine, thank you for stepping in to be a substitute host for me.
That is literally one of my favorite things to do. It's pure fun, and I'll make sure your hot seat's comfortable. It's your show, after all. So I'm turning the tables, and let's kick this off. One of the cool things that listeners will know after listening to the trailer of the show is that you've had a unique career path. You've done various things. What have you learned about choosing a career path in your life?
I would love to just make a note that it has been unexpected, like many of the guests that we've had on the show. I anticipated that I was going to go to BYU and I would meet someone wonderful. It's a religious affiliated college, and a lot of the religious affiliated colleges have high marriage rates. The students meet, they start families. I really imagined that is what would happen to me, and it didn't. And I really felt called really towards the end of my senior year to do a master's program. And I chose a master's in public administration. I actually, when I came to this, I just had this feeling sitting in my heart that I needed to do something that was not teaching, which is what my degree was. And so I literally went next door to my neighbors and asked for a graduate program catalog, because this is back in the day when you actually had paper
Mhm.
catalogs.
I totally
And
remember paper catalogs.
yeah. So I'm flipping page by page, and this is what I did. I literally asked the question for every degree, am I eligible? And it came down to 3 degrees. I could go to law school, but I hadn't taken the LSAT. I could do family therapy. And I thought, I don't want to listen to people's problems all day long. I just felt like it would be really heavy. And the last remaining option was public administration. And so I thought, I guess I'll go get a master's in public administration. And I remember my mom said, Emily, what are you going to do with that? And I was like, I don't know. I think I might like publicly administer something. I have no idea. So I talked to some people. I had this background in social sciences and looking at things from a family system perspective. And I thought I can go and work in a nonprofit and support communities and people in family or group settings. And so I went down, I did my master's degree. I got to the end of the program and they asked for a 10-year career plan. And I was like, deer in the headlights. What do you write? And I felt really embarrassed about it. I remember thinking as I was writing it, this is a total load of hooey. It was totally made up. Like I literally was like, I'll write something that I think someone would want to hear because I'm getting a master's. And I went to class that day and had a really interesting experience because I didn't want to say anything at all. I actually went to Arizona State University, which is about polar opposites from Brigham Young
Mm.
University. And I'm in a graduate program with a bunch of professionals. It was over the weekends because everybody's working full time while they're doing this. And all of a sudden, woman after woman began raising her hand and saying, this was very difficult for me. And it was the first time that I realized, oh, other women have a really hard time figuring out what this career path should be. And a lot of it was because we didn't know what role family or children would play in our life. And we've seen this play out now. During COVID, there were a lot of women who had to turn down promotions because women do take the heavier load. They tend to take the heavier load of childcare and things along those lines. And this was a very diverse group of women, very different backgrounds. They weren't all at this religious affiliated university. It was just this very normal group of women saying, I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. So it's very hard to figure this out. I probably 10 or 15 years later I was working at a research hospital doing organization development. And they asked us for a 10-year career plan again. And I was like, I don't know. So what I did is I thought, well, I guess I could be realistic. At least now I have some experience to think about what I would maybe want to do. And I remember thinking, well, I'll plan it for 20 years from now. I thought, maybe I'll have kids. So maybe I could think about being a consultant and working part-time because I had a mom who stayed home and also worked. She was a violinist. So she taught violin and actually a very talented violinist. So I had seen this idea that maybe you'd work part-time and you were home with kids. And so I created this idea of maybe I would be a consultant and ended up leaving that job after about 3 years. And by happenstance, ended up doing this 17 years early. So I have realized a couple of things that I think are really important. Going back to this question about choosing a career path. First of all, I always thought I was supposed to have this very direct line. I thought you go to school and you get a degree and then you do that. And then you just keep doing that. And what I've realized now is a lot of people shift. In fact, a lot of individuals who become the CEO have kind of generalist knowledge. They've worked in lots of different parts of the company. So I've realized that number one, that's really normal. I really love the book, How Will You Measure Your Life by Clayton Christensen, who talks about how there are some people who plan like this is going to be the path and other people are more open to these different options. And so the question becomes, how do we pick a path that's good for us? And there are a few things that I've done, some of which I really wish I'd had someone walk me through when I was working internally. So I'm just going to tell people some of the things that have been helpful to me and that have been helpful to some of the people that I've worked with. So the Cheshire Cat line, where it doesn't matter where you go if you don't know where you're going. I think that's really valuable, but also it's really hard to know where we want to go. So there are 3 questions when I was trained as a coach that I think are really helpful. And the 3 questions are this. Number 1, imagine yourself at 90 years old. Picture what you're wearing. Imagine where you're sitting. What's the building you're in? And you are having a conversation with the people who are most important to you. Who's there? What is the really important message that you would share? The 4 or 5 things that you just want these people you love to know this is so important. What's that message? And you can spend about 4 or 5 minutes going through that. But I asked some questions in there that are actually really important and we'll come back to. What were you wearing? Where were you? Because somebody might picture themselves in a cabin. Someone might picture themselves in the home that they grew up in or the home they currently are in. Other people might picture something very different than where they're in today. And all of these are going to play into what our goals are. So we think about that for 90 years old. Then I want you to step back and imagine that you're giving a TED Talk. A lot of TED Talks have a general concept, and then they cover 2 or 3 principles that support it. And then there's this invitation. So the question would be, if you were going to give a TED Talk that you knew was going to leave a legacy of some sort, what would be the topic?
Mm-hmm.
What are the principles? And also, who's in the audience that you're trying to influence? Who do you want to have there? The third question is more of a creative question. And the question is this, or the exercise is this. I want you to imagine that you are looking at a billboard and there is a one sentence message on that billboard and there is an image. And by the way, 10 million people are going to drive by that billboard every day for the rest of their lives. And it is going to be ingrained in their mind. What's your sentence? And what's the message? What's the image that you have there? What's the tone of it? Is it cheerful? Is it a warning? What do you have there? If you can go through that, hopefully you can take away a theme. And you'll notice that we started with 4 or 5 important things for the family. And then we got a little bit more narrow and we thought 2 or 3 things. And then we get down to the one. But as we look at this, hopefully you're able to sit down and say, you know what? I think the legacy points that I want to have is really this. And as I've been through this exercise, I've come to the point that I have it down to an analogy, which is that I want to be like a master gardener who supports people in finding peace in their life. There's a really wonderful show called Big Dreams, Small Spaces. There's a British gardener named Monty Don who comes in and people show him their garden plan. And he says wonderful things like, oh, the herb garden needs to be moved to a different place so that it has sun. And you think, of course, the herb garden needs to be moved. And he points them there, but the people do the work. They're the ones who are digging in. And some people have dreams of Italian gardens where there's lights and people come in. And at the end of every episode, you see their families coming in and enjoying it. And then there's another woman who has this dream of Alice in Wonderland for her daughter. She wants her daughter to be able to go out and explore. And it's a much less expensive, much simpler project. And everybody's very delighted. And to me, if I can be professionally in a place where people are being invited in to work on their goal, their vision, and I can be supportive of that. It's not my agenda. It's just, here's how we can work with this. And eventually they walk away with something that's wonderful. That vision is really important to me because it's helped me be able to tease out as opportunities come. Does that fit in? So, Christine, I've never wanted to do a podcast. Not at the top of my list.
Weird.
Yeah. And yet, as I think about it, we bring these women to the show who have an opportunity to craft a message that is what they want. All of the questions I ask are crafted in support of them being able to share the story. Even the examples I share are designed. We talk beforehand about what do we create and what can I provide that will reinforce or bring things to the table. And it's not all 100% planned out, but it's pretty well thought through and based around what women want to do. And we see women coming away who've been guests who are feeling more confident. They know what they can contribute and they feel an increase in joy. And so for me, that's very consistent. If you were to say to me, Emily, there's a porn company that would like to hire you, I would have to say, and this is the second part, once you know what it is, you also need to be aware of your values, right? That wouldn't be consistent with me and my values and what goes out into the world. So I think that if you can get clear on your values, if you can get clear on your questions, it becomes a lot easier to be able to say, as opportunities come to you, does this feel like a good opportunity? Yes or no?
That was juicy. What about making a choice when you don't quite know what to do? I can relate to this. Are there women you've talked to who struggled up front? There's a lot of choices. Like, what if that clarity has not come yet?
Well, I think this is part of the lesson that I learned from my graduate program and from the experience I had at the U, why is there only one path? Why do we have to write one 10-year plan? I think I know that sounds crazy. I actually think for women, for people, and I actually have a good friend who's a gentleman who's stepped away to do caretaking for his parents. For people who have that scenario, it may actually be important to have a couple plans and to be able to dream big, to say, okay, let's say I'm on this path. What's my dream if this path continues? And what's the big dream that I have? What's the number one dream that I have? If that's the number one dream, what do I need to do and how do I pursue it? But if that doesn't happen and I stay on this other path, what would be a wonderful path to be on? And I think the path that we pursue is the one that says, okay, I'm on this path and this is an exciting future. And how do I also honor this other dream that I have that I think would be really helpful? I think as we open our options up to be able to say, it doesn't have to be this exact path. It could be, I'm going to sit down and create a dream. I'm going to think about what I really, really want. And then I'm going to have this other one that if it doesn't happen, I'll do that. And what's really interesting is a lot of times those actually align and are pretty similar. Like we don't, yeah.
It's so
Anyway.
true. You are speaking such relatable stories. Okay, once you're into your career, what have you learned about actually managing your career?
Well, I'm going to take us back to very naive Emily. I just was so naive. Christine, my first job was in government. And so I had a master's degree and granted, this is about 20 years ago, so the salary would be different now. I think I was offered $42,000. And I just thought it was amazing.
You made it.
I was like, oh gosh. I was like, it's so much money. My brother was graduating. He graduated about a year later with his MBA. I guarantee you he was earning double to triple what I was earning, right? No questions. I was very naive. And so when I went to work, I was really good about trying to figure things out. I approached it like I did school. Okay, put your head down, study, do the assignment, study, do the assignment. And I wasn't aware of things like the importance of networking and building relationships with people. And those things would come over time. Hopefully they have come over time. Well, one of the things that really undid me and just shocked me is performance reviews. I was so unprepared because I was treating it like a report card. And at school, you get the assignment, you do the job, and you get a grade. And I thought if you do the work, you get an A. And that's not what a performance review is. And I wish someone had sat down and said to me, it is not a report card. And it is not an assessment of your value or your worth. So when I think about what I've learned over time and what I have finally recognized for myself professionally is that when you look at a performance evaluation, it's really more of an assessment of how are you doing in general. So if I had received a performance evaluation 3 weeks after I had started, it would be very natural to see needs improvement in every single area because you need to improve in all the areas. And that's not a judgment against you. You can even be in the same role and pick up a new assignment and get needs improvement on that because you're not skilled at it yet.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that I really wish that I'd had that perspective. And I've learned that for both. So I've written performance reviews and I've received performance reviews. And there are 3 things that I've realized are really important across the board, whether you are giving or receiving. One of which is to check your stories. It's really easy for us to have this story of, I did amazing. And yet if we step back, maybe there were parts that we could improve on. Same thing for leaders. It's easy. There's this concept called the 80-20 rule, meaning if somebody's doing 80% of their job well, the performance evaluation or the feedback should reflect 80% of the good. And there's some nuance to that, right? Because if somebody needs to improve, they maybe need some additional information on that. So it might start getting a little bit built out or feel like more than 20%. And that's helpful to them to understand how they need to improve. Yet also we can let that little piece run away and overtake the performance evaluation. I had a performance evaluation a few years after my very first one where I was told I wasn't getting a role because I hadn't done something. So in this particular structure, the government's roles, there were 3 levels and there was no limit of how many people could promote into those. It was based on qualifications. And I remember going in and my manager said, we're not promoting you because you didn't do this one specific thing. And I knew that I had done it. I had happened during that time to be covering a project. My coworker that was on the project with me had been out for personal reasons for about 4 months. So I'd been carrying a ton. I thought I looked great. I had been optimistic. I had been on top of things. I had been trying my best. So I was floored when all of a sudden I'm not getting this promotion. And I knew I had done this task. So I left, walked back into the other room, forwarded him the emails because I had emailed the information to him, walked back in. It took me less than a minute. And it didn't feel great, right? Yet let me cut him a break here that there was a lot going on. He had multiple teams. And here's the lesson for both of us. There was something rolling in his mind relative to this 80-20 that was not being conveyed to me. So having more regular checkups would have been helpful on both sides to be able to say, what's happening? Where are you thinking? How am I doing? Is there anything you think you're missing? I also look back and I understand the value of checking those thoughts, checking those stories, checking in with each other a lot more and doing that. So I think that has been, as I think about some key principles, I think that's good. As a leader, my very first manager was so good about doing pre-work and context, which helped me promote really quickly. So when I first started, she would pull me into her office before a meeting and she'd say, okay, Emily, this is what the meeting's about. This is what's expected of you. And this is when you need to share the information. So she did the pre-work to help me understand what I needed to do to be successful. And I think that was really, really helpful in so many ways. And then even just that context for them to be able to say, you're developing, so it's needs improvement, but that's not bad. Versus being able to say very clearly, we need to improve this area or your job may be at risk.
Yeah.
That's a very different message. So being really clear. And then the other thing that I've learned about this is the difference between knowing your worth versus your value, which I think is really important. And then also being really clear about accountability versus over responsibility. So,
can you go further? What do you mean by worth versus value?
For a long time, how I was doing at work felt like the measure of my personal worth or value. I was very wrapped up in it. I worked hard. And if somebody felt like I wasn't doing well, I felt really bad. But I also felt like maybe that meant I wasn't very good personally. It can feel very personal. And what I've realized is these are really just measures of how you're contributing to the company and also how you're developing. But it has nothing to do with your worth. You're a human. We don't earn worth. We're human beings. Like nobody looks at a child and says, "Oh, they're not worth very much." They are. Like we all have worth. This is just, and I think that's why it's so important to be able to separate this out and say, what's the difference between a criticism and a complaint? A criticism being, you're this, you're bad, you're disrespectful. It's a statement about your character, which, by the way, may or may not be true and can be how someone looks at you, right?
Totally.
That's very different than a complaint, which is, we need you to do something different. And so if you can look at these performance evaluations and think, is this a criticism or a complaint? And if it's a complaint, I can do something about it and I don't have to take it personally. And if it's a criticism, sometimes we have to tease our way through and say, okay, it sounds like something I'm doing needs to change. You can't always change what someone's opinion is of you, but you can deal with a complaint. So that's what I mean by worthless
Oh,
value.
okay. Then my other follow-up, you teased this at the end of your last answer. What do you mean about accountability versus over responsibility?
So when I first started working, going back to this I'm at school
Mhm.
mentality, I really, with the best of intention, if something didn't go well, what I was trying to do is say, well, this was the assignment and this is how I'm trying to fulfill it.
Mhm.
And here's how this comes out. The way it comes out is it's not my fault. You told me to do this,
Mhm.
which can look like you're not taking accountability.
Mm.
The catch there being, if you have someone who does that and you're a leader, then the question may be, well, let's talk about that then, because it sounds like what I'm expecting of you isn't clear yet, right?
Mhm.
So there's a chance for us to get curious as leaders. We need to be more clear. I just was trying so hard to meet performance expectations. And now looking back, I realized I could have just said, thank you for the feedback. It's the better way to respond. There may be a point in time to go to someone and say, after that, okay, I've had time to consider. Can we talk about something? Because I think I'm interpreting what your needs are differently. Here's
Mhm.
my understanding of what you want. It's not received well if
Mhm.
you keep saying, but you told me to, but you told me to, right? That wasn't exactly what I said, but for some, that's how it feels for people. So
Yeah.
that once I figured that out, I overcorrected and became overly responsible, meaning if someone says to me, well, someone thinks you're this way, I began thinking, okay, well, perception's reality, right?
Mhm.
But actually, perception isn't reality. When you do, there was an article about change management. I don't know if I'll be able to find it, but it looked at how people were viewed when change was introduced. And they had an example of someone who asked a lot of questions. And the same people were observing this. And one observer looked at it and said, oh my gosh, that person is so interested in figuring things out. They are going to champion that change. Another person watching the exact same scenario said, that person is clearly trying to stonewall.
Mm.
So two people can see the exact same thing and have very different perceptions. And for
Mm.
me, one of the things I had to learn is I am responsible for my words. I am responsible for my actions. And I am responsible for what I know my intent is. So if I had bad intent, I'm responsible for that. And if I had good intent, I can take confidence in that. What I'm not responsible for and what no one is responsible for are all of these other perceptions or beliefs about them. Now, can you navigate that and figure out a better way to work within the company that's received better? Yes.
Mhm.
Yes, you can do that. But I think it's really important to not say, oh, perception's reality. They think I'm difficult. Therefore, I am difficult.
Yeah.
We can really lose ourselves if we start believing what everybody else thinks about or everybody else's perceptions about us. Just be really clear about what's accountable. This is what I did. This is the actions I took. And if someone has a complaint, thank you for letting me know. Let me think on this. If you need additional information, you can go to them, give it a little bit of space. Hitting them right in the emotional moment isn't the time to do it, but you can go back to them and say, I think I need some clarification. Yeah.
This is so good. I was gonna ask you about how you can take good responsibility, but I think you've already alluded to that in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
specifically with your story from your manager going back,
Yeah.
getting the email. That's a lot
Yeah.
of wisdom. So let's shift gears like you do in every episode. And I want to hear your thoughts about leadership roles at church. I know you have a lot of things you've learned. So what have you learned about leadership roles at church?
I would first of all say this. My lessons continue to come. And I think that's really important because, and I mentioned this to someone earlier, that there's a difference between having learned something and wisdom and perfection. I have been in leadership roles in our women's organization, as well as our Bible study for adults. They call it Institute. It's like classes. And I had this idea in my mind that I needed to be perfect. What I think I actually needed to do was step in and learn because there was times that I faced new experiences. And one of the experiences that I have since learned was a really good lesson for me in a church and volunteer setting, but also really
Mm.
pertinent to my life and also at work. I'll tell you what the scenario was. I was asked to be the president of this group of classes. There were five, there were about 250, maybe 150. I think there were 150 students there at the time. And honestly, I was not a super committed attendee. And so I showed up this one day, person who sees all the classes, and the teachers says to me, I think we need to have you be the president. I was like, cool. I have no idea what I'm doing, but cool. And I still laugh about that. Like I had no idea what I was doing. And so I meet later with the stake president, the ecclesiastical leader, and he says to me, tell me what your vision is. What do you want to do with this? And in my mind, I was the student. And I admittedly, so this is right after grad school, so I don't feel like I'd really embraced the idea that you're a grown-up adult. You can have a job. And I felt like, well, I don't know, you're in charge. You guys are the adults here, right? I mean, I am an adult, but I just was thinking of it very differently. And we had this funny back and forth where he was like, well, what do you want? I was like, I don't know. What do you want? Well, I don't know. What do you want? What do you know? And so we had this back and forth, and I realized and learned from this the importance of, if we are in a leadership responsibility, of coming up with an idea and having solutions. So I've seen this play out in a few ways. One of which is, so first of all, in a church or volunteer capacity, come up with a few ideas, brainstorm one or two things that you would enjoy doing. At home, there's a book called A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, and I love this book. It's one of my favorites. It was hard for me to get into, but the gentleman basically explains that his life story was being made into a movie, and someone looked at him and said, you don't have a very good life. Cool, right? Something we all want to hear. And he was taken aback by that. And he said, what do you mean? He said, a really good story involves a main character, and there's a conflict, and they have to overcome it. So he ended up sharing this idea with a friend of his whose daughter, so his friend's daughter was dating someone who was into drugs. She's this teenage girl. She's 14. And so the author says to his friend, yeah, your daughter's not living a very good story. So this dad starts thinking about this and says, what is the story that I have given her? And he comes home one day and he tells his wife and his daughter, we are going to fund something like a $50,000 orphanage, and we're going to raise it and come up with this money as a family. The wife is floored. It's not a good time for them to do this financially. The daughter is upset, like, this is so uncool. I can't believe you're asking me to do this. The mom comes to him the next day and says, we need this as a family. And kind of this softening of heart. The daughter eventually does. And the end of the story is that this author asks his friend one day how things are going. And this gentleman says, my daughter ended up breaking up with that boyfriend because when a woman recognizes who she doesn't let people treat her the way that guy does. And so this idea of having something that we can look to, or an important story that we're leaning to in our personal life, there can be some real good that comes of it. And I've also seen this in a work setting. So when you first start a job, a lot of times you're learning, but at some point, you need to stop just taking problems to your boss. You need to start being able to say, I see the problem and I have a couple of ideas. Can we talk through it and see what you would like? And that's really, I think, if you're not sure if someone wants to hear your perspective, your idea, a great way to start is to say, I appreciate this that you've shared and this that you've shared. I have a different perspective, or have an idea that I'd like to put on a table. Would you be open to it? But I do think I've been grateful for that perspective that I learned really in a volunteer setting, of coming up with and having something that we look to and are trying to do on a bigger scale.
Okay. This is so good. You've mentioned the overlap you just did about this applies to volunteer in church, but how has your faith played a role in your career and vice versa?
I would still love to have a family and kids. It's been a disappointment. That's a very gentle way of saying it. It's been a disappointment that it hasn't happened yet. And so in the meantime, I have leaned into prayer and to trying to connect with heaven to figure out my path. And there have been times that it has entirely shifted the direction of where I would go, of trying to listen to that gut instinct. And for me, I really do feel like God talks to us and that we can pray. I think of God as my Heavenly Father, that He cares about us and He cares about these little things. He cares about the sheep and the little birds and the lilies of the field. And so I've been thankful for that because I think that has been really helpful for me. There was a time that I didn't know what to do, for example, with my business. And I was very prayerful, and it ended up entirely changing as I would listen every day. I would write in this journal, and every morning I would think about what comes to mind. And then I'm going to really try and act on it. And that was so helpful. I will also say there have been times that work was really hard and life was hard. I think it can be hard if you had an idea of how life would turn out or how your career would turn out and it's not turning out, and it can be really disappointing. And um and I have had to wrestle through faith experiences. And what I think I've come away with is two things. First of all, I remember a time that I was really struggling and trying to figure out, how do I handle this situation? Is my faith helping me? And I remember going to church that day, and someone gave this talk. And in the middle of this talk, he randomly says, if you're having questions like this, please stay. And I read something else, like something else just happened to come across my desk 1 or 2 days later that had the same concept. And I've been willing in my life to walk that faith journey of, I don't always know, but I see good coming from my life from it. And as I have relied on my faith, I think it has definitely helped me professionally. And then I also think using my talents has helped me in a volunteer setting. Like we were talking about earlier, we have these opportunities and these leadership experiences. And so I think that the two of them have really played together. And I will say this, life today may not look like what I imagined. And there have been times that it's been hard, but my life is really good. And I'm really grateful when I think back to that young girl graduating from college, just so surprised. I think I'd go back and say thank you for continuing forward. And there's so many good things ahead of you as you use your talents, as you try to do good. You're going to learn some tough things, but you're going to get through it, and it will help you if you lean on the Lord. So I think that's how the two have played together.
Thank you so much. We're going to close this episode just like you do all of your others. And so invite you to share a mic drop, piece of wisdom, something that's made a big impact. I think you were queuing it up, maybe back to 22-year-old Emily or maybe something else. But what do you want to share for our listeners?
I think what I would want to say is that you matter. You're not going to be perfect. If you're not perfect, that's okay. You can do something about that. You can learn to be a better communicator. You can learn to be a better listener. You can learn your job. Just remember that that's not the measure of your worth. You matter. You are valuable. And we need you in this world.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for letting me guest host for you today. Thanks for making the show. And thanks for sharing with us today.
Well, thank you for coming on and doing this. We appreciate everybody who has listened. We hope that you will find something that will really encourage you and strengthen you professionally and personally. As always, please subscribe on the YouTube channel or on your favorite listening app. And be sure to sign up for the email newsletters at www.calltotheworkforce.com to learn about new episodes. Have a great week.